Talk about banks. We got Bank of America announcing earnings at the end of the week. Everyone's looking forward to that. Bill Bartmann joins us right now, author of Bailout Riches, to talk a little bit about failing banks. Bank of America, not one of them, but there are several out there. Welcome, Bill.
Well, welcome. Thank you, and good to see you again.
Is there a sort of misconception that when all these banks fail, that the FDIC takes over all of them?
Well, there is that misconception. The FDIC is one of the regulators that takes over failed banks, and it's the one that probably gets the most shrift because the OCC and the Fed don't seem to get much press these days. But the FDIC is the one who is essentially of all Americans, and they're the ones that make sure that when the banks do fail, that they are liquidated in the most efficient fashion.
The FDIC is broke, though, isn't it, for all intents and purposes?
It is. Well, for all intents and purposes, it's broken. For financial purposes, it's absolutely broke. It's about $64 billion in the hole. In the last 3 or 4 months, Sheila Bair issued a premium notice to all of the 8,100 member banks, asking them to pay in advance the next 3 years' worth of premiums. Well, they have done that. That money has come into the FDIC coffers, and the FDIC has relatively promptly spent all of that money, which kind of leaves them between a rock and a hard place because the bank failure rate is really just beginning. So there's going to be a lot of losses coming in the near future.
What do they do to try and stem the tide here with these losses?
Well, the only thing they can do is to dispose of the assets that they've acquired from these liquidating institutions, and one of them is an auction that's going on this morning in Atlanta. It's the loans that come out of the old Silverton Bank. When Silverton failed, it kind of was about a 5.6 on the Richter bank scale because Silverton was kind of a banker's bank. It did a lot of participations, and now the FDIC is offering to sell about $400 million worth of loans that came out of Silverton. But the banking group, the banking industry, the Community Bankers Association, has actually filed an injunction against the FDIC, asking the FDIC not to sell those loans because of the negative impact it would have on other, still, we'll call them healthy banks, although that's probably a misnomer.
Bill, is some of this necessary? I mean, did we get ahead of ourselves? There were banks popping up on every corner when things were going well. People were very readily making loans. It was easy. Is some of this just the necessary part of the consolidation process?
It absolutely is. We in the United States now, with 8,100 banks, and during the last crisis, we were up to over 12,000 banks. And I'm not talking about branches. On branches, we have 125,000 branches. We have more banks than there are Walgreens or Walmarts. Now,
Wow.
To me, that just tells us what's wrong with the system. We have too many competing for too little of the profit. And quite frankly, that means there's going to be a whole bunch of banks that go out of business just because, quite frankly, there's not enough to sustain them.
Bill, certainly what we've seen with the other banks taking over these banks over the last couple of years, they've been getting them at great deals. I mean, fire sale prices. Do you think that market will continue once the FDIC starts to securitize these assets and sell them off?
I really do. I think we've just begun to see it. Now, I lived through the last crisis, and as some of us did, and quite frankly, we were very fortunate to be at the right place at the right time and to be a buyer when the FDIC was a seller. Well, lo and behold, deja vu, here we are again. The FDIC now has 207 banks in their basket and about to add perhaps as many as 1,000 more. And when the FDIC starts selling, it really just pushes the prices down. So it's a great time to be a buyer and a real bad time to be a bank.
Bill, a lot of people blame the regulators for all these bank failures. You know, Washington Mutual hearings are going on right now. Largest bank failure in history. Question was, where were the regulators? Is that part of this? Do we blame the Office of Thrift Supervision, the FDIC, for the fact that we have so many failures going on right now?
Absolutely, and I love Sheila Bair. I think if I've been happily married for 36 years. If I wasn't married to my wife, I'd chase Sheila Bair down to catch her. Because I think she is probably the smartest woman in Washington, and I don't put all of this at her doorstep. But the regulators clearly were on watch, and this happened on their watch. So much like the captain of a ship, there's got to be somebody that's held accountable and held responsible. And quite frankly, there was an awful lot of people that dropped the ball on this one.
Bill, when the FDIC looks to sell the assets of any particular bank, are there certain asset classes that are much easier to sell than others, and how will they go about that process?
Absolutely. The asset classes that are the easiest to sell are the ones where there are the most buyers for, and that means a product that is relatively commoditized. So commercial real estate and residential real estate, the FDIC has already sold about $4 billion worth of that product already in the last year and a half. Now, the private banks are selling a different product. They're selling consumer loans and charged-off credit cards. And last year alone, they sold over $8 billion of that. So there's quite frankly, a pretty aggressive sales campaign going on, both by the government and by, we'll call them, the healthy banks.
Bill, thanks so much for giving us your insight on all this.
You're very welcome. Thank you, and have a great morning.
You too. Bill Bartmann, author of Bailout